Thank you everyone for coming. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Christina Bagatavicius. And I'll just give you a little intro, and she can share her story about her journey in entrepreneurship and the twists and turns that have taken, as well as how to balance it with life in general. So I think it'll be really enlightening. And I'm also so excited about who is here, because there are a lot of incredible people in the room. And if you haven't met each other yet, then I think it'll be a great opportunity during the networking session to make some new connections. So Christina is the co-founder and principal at Bespoke Collective, a creative consultancy that is reimagining how culture and civic life brings people together. Her expertise runs across public engagement, communications, and cultural planning. She got her first professional start working in the arts at Tate Museum in London, and then at Bruce Mau Design, an internationally renowned design and innovation studio. Christina made the decision to start her business over a decade ago because she wanted to focus on projects she cares about and believes in. In order to do this, she has needed to develop a unique, nimble, and scalable business model centered on creative collaboration. Over the years, Christina has worked on the launch of the Fogo Island Inn, which is such an incredible thing, the revitalization of Toronto's waterfront, the Indigenous Fashion Arts Festival, a strategic plan for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and public consultations for Ontario Place. Christina also frequently works on smaller community-based and arts initiatives alongside larger city-building projects. So with that, I will let Christina take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for making the time to come out as well. I realize this is that last week in the lead up to Christmas holiday madness, so I'm really grateful you're all here, and I'm delighted to be here today. I often get asked to present information and material for projects and for the work I'm doing, but it's rare that I get to kind of take a minute to take a deep breath and think about it as a business and share that back. So this has been a really wonderful self-reflection process for me to pull together some thoughts. And I want to thank Christine, for creating that opportunity. I'm really, really grateful. And with that, I've pulled together a bunch of slides. If you can't see them because I'm sitting in front of them, feel free to shift too. But if you can see them, that's great. And what I thought I'd do is I'd start with where I am now and share a little bit about my business today. And then we'd work a little bit back. I'd share a couple career highlights so you can get a sense of the kind of work that I do. And then I'd get into the trenches with you all a bit on my backstory, a little how I came to get where I was, and 7 life lessons I've identified thinking about it that I wish I had known 10 years ago, that I'm grateful for now. Pulling together this presentation gave me that opportunity to identify those, and I'm excited to share them with you, and hopefully a couple of them might resonate with your community. So my business today, as Christine said, my business is called Bespoke Collective, and it's a creative consultancy that's reimagining how culture and civic life brings people together. That is a big, complicated sort of idea. And to be honest with you, when I go home for the holidays, I have a really hard time explaining what I do to anybody who asks. And I'm like, oh, I'm just a consultant, and kind of like brush it under the carpet in that way. But I incorporated the business in 2011. And it's a woman-led company. I'm a sole proprietor of the business, and I work across projects and clients, from really small community and arts-based initiatives and organizations to philanthropic projects, to city-scale projects as well, city planning-based projects with governments. So it's like a real range of different clients that I work with. And it's taken a long time to build trust and to build those relationships, would be the other thing I would say. So it's been a very long journey, 12 years actually in counting. I'm glad it's not 13 years, which would feel unlucky to kind of start on. I've also realized only now, 12 years in, that it actually is a values-driven business more than it is, a traditional kind of model where you're trying to sort of make as much profit as possible. So I've shifted my perspective and my relationship with that a bit. I used to think, I had this notion and idea of what success was supposed to look like, and I was constantly measuring myself against these external kind of parameters for what success is supposed to look like. And it's kind of only now that I'm settling into my 40s that I'm really proud of the values that I care about, and the fact that I'm committed to those values, and when I allow myself into those values, I feel like I'm achieving, a degree of success for myself. So actually, just over the past year, I've identified the 4 values that are the underpinnings for my business. The first one is just new and better ways of doing. I'm really interested in shaking things up, doing things in a fresh way. I feel like since the pandemic, there's a real appetite for that. And there are lots of consultants who do an excellent job of helping people along their path through a tried and tested and true way. I'm not one of them. I'm the person you come to when you want a breath of fresh air. So I'm excited to be able to own that as part of my business. I also believe deeply in collaboration and collaborative power. So I'm always working in teams. I'm always co-collaborating with other small businesses, other entrepreneurs on an ongoing basis. And I'm really open and explicit about that as part of how the business model runs. I also believe deeply in equitable and sustainable futures. I have 2 small kids, and I really hope I can leave the world at least 1 peg better than where it is now through my life journey. And I feel like my business has that kind of responsibility. So I think about climate change, I think about equity, I think about Indigenous land back as part of the work that I do, and I try to bring those conversations every opportunity that I can. And the last kind of value that underpins my business is just compassion and connection, and realizing kind of wearing your heart and caring for others actually can be part of a business model and can be a way you relate to people and a way you can be successful. And it took me a while to also kind of see that as part of my journey, but I'm now proudly kind of putting it on my website, so I'm there. So, amidst this values-driven business, when I talk about Bespoke, I talk about how we wholeheartedly believe that culture can be a catalyst for positive change, that we're expansive and ambitious, but also nimble. We begin with deep listening, pursuing new ways of doing, and also believing that projects, need to end up greater than the sum of their parts, trying to bring a kind of bird's eye view to things. I'm also passionate about the highest caliber of work and quality, standing for processes that engage a range of voices, and then embracing that kind of responsibility I was saying for a better future. So for clients, this is kind of the shtick I often present to give them a sense of where I'm coming from. So when you get into the actual nitty gritty of my business, there's 3 core offerings. I do cultural planning, programming, and research. So I help arts organizations often do feasibility studies or research or figure out new models for initiatives. That's one core piece. The other piece I do is facilitation and community engagement. So I'll work on a town or a city level to support public input into processes. Often, processes led by towns, cities, government, trying to kind of both advocate for the voices of the community to be heard thoughtfully and trying to design those processes in an engaging and fun way so people also feel appreciated as part of that kind of a process and that they're heard. And then the other piece I do is communications and storytelling work, but mostly within the public sector. So I think all of my clients actually are in the public sector or the arts, and that's kind of been a constant. And these are just some of the clients that I've had over the years, just to give you a sense of, I know it can feel a little airy-fairy in terms of my offering. So work a lot with cities, with towns. I've worked with Fogo Island Inn, as Christine mentioned, the Drake Hotel, also small artist-run spaces and community projects as well, and not-for-profits have been part of my clients. And I work across North America as well. So my core client base is in Toronto, but I recently worked with Triennial in New Orleans, and so there's some projects across North America that I've built out. And then if you want to know about the operations and kind of the behind the scenes stuff, I have 3 employees. So it's actually a really small business, pretty nimble. 6 long-term collaborators who I bring into projects on an ongoing basis. And then probably about 30 specialized freelancers that I work with and small businesses that I bring in depending on the specificity of the project. And that allows me to scale up and do really big projects when I want to, although it is an art form to learn how to do that. And it's taken me some time, and there's been some real wins and some more difficult moments as well. I also right now have a remote working situation set up. I used to have an office for about 8 years, and then during the pandemic we got rid of it. And actually my team's kind of across Canada. I've got someone in Newfoundland and someone in Montreal and someone in Toronto. And I think, coming out of the pandemic, we've figured out how to make that work in a new kind of way. And I feel like that flexibility is healthy for people too, if you can offer it, which is great. So the scale of my projects are hugely variable. I could be doing a small, $3,000 piece of work, which I'll be doing tomorrow, which is just helping a community museum, come up with a concept for an exhibition. Or I could be working on public engagement for 3 years on a city project that is like a $250,000 project with 16 subcontractors working on it. So the range is really broad. And I have maybe 5 to 15 clients a year, depending on how big those projects are. You don't want to stack them too high. I'm always struggling with how little or how much to take in terms of work. And then each project always involves collaboration. It's rare that I do something on my own unless it's a speaking engagement. But otherwise, I always like to have teams of 2, 3, 4 working with me, because I actually believe those conversations lead to better work in the long run. So that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of kind of the operations for the business. And that's where I am today. And then I thought I'd give you a little flavor of the work that I do, and then share some of those life lessons. So Christine mentioned Fogo Island, and it was one of the actual first projects I ever worked on running my own business. I was 6 months pregnant, actually, on the journey, and I had to check in with them to see what would happen if I had to deliver early. And they were like, yeah, there's no hospitals, but it used to be an island with midwives, so you should be okay. It was a little worrying, but it was so exciting as a project. So I flew in to Newfoundland in a snowstorm, and then I had to fly again to Gander, and then I had to take a car to a boat, and then I got to Fogo Island, where I got to work with Zita Cobb, who's an incredible entrepreneur who had made her money, I think, in Silicon Valley, and come back to Fogo Island, where she's originally from, and recognized that a lot of the traditions that she loved and held dear were endangered, and that there was a kind of a brain drain happening where creatives were leaving the island and the population was decreasing. So she put all of her efforts into a cultural revitalization project for Fogo Island, which was pretty amazing. And the idea is she developed this gorgeous inn where people could experience the authenticity of their culture, and everything that the inn makes in terms of profit is reinvested back into the community. So it's a really kind of beautiful example of something new. So they hired me to help them launch and do the communications for the inn. And I think they hired me in part because they wanted somebody to do communications who wasn't going to do sort of a typical branding tone or selling something. And so we really shifted the narrative on the community and on the kind of the different traditions that were there, the quilt making, the 7 seasons, the building of boats, those kinds of things. So it was a really beautiful first project. And then one of the projects that was the first project I had in Toronto that was of a scalable size where people actually started hiring me in Toronto after. It's funny, I was getting hired everywhere but in Toronto where I was living. It was a little bit closed off for the first few years of my career. Was the Bentway, which is a new type of public space that's under the Gardner. And I worked with a foundation, basically, and urban planners and architects on how to launch the space in a way that could be exciting for Toronto, recognizing the Gardner cuts the city off from the water. So there's a kind of really there's a heaviness to that space. So how do you kind of think about ways to make it feel invigorated and uplifting when it carries the weight of infrastructure that divides a city? So it was a really incredible project. We helped them launch it, and then we also launched a citywide naming campaign where we got 891 names, I think, suggested, and did a 6-month process with the community to come up with a name that suited the space. And if you're wondering, the Bentway refers to the bents in the underneath space that hold up the structure, which became the kind of brand identity. Another example of a project I did with Christine, actually, on a freelance basis, which was amazing, was developing an arts and health program at Mount Sinai Hospital, working with the Drake Hotel. And they were trying to integrate art opportunities for patients that were inpatients in the hospital setting. For me, the project was incredible in that it helped me see the relationship between creativity and well-being. And there's all this research out there internationally around the connection that the arts can have on making us feel better across our mental health, our physical health, spiritual health, all of those things. Really fascinating research. There's like one statistic I love so much, which is they did a study, I think in London, where people sitting in theater audiences were watching a performance together. It was a musical performance, and apparently their hearts actually beat in rhythm after a bit in that kind of shared community space. So there are these beautiful bits of information around what the arts can do to make us feel a little bit better. And sadly, this project never came to be. And this often happens with the projects I work on, because it's often at the ideas point where I'm helping people kind of frame it up because of the pandemic. So what happened was we developed a beautiful project, and you can see these artist activities people could do from their hospital beds, and we had creative projects we were getting ready to roll out. But the hospital was so overextended and so burnt out from the demands of the pandemic and COVID that they never were able to fully launch it. Even though it was like one of those moments where, on paper, it feels like we didn't do it. You know what I mean? You feel that kind of frustration. But then at the same time, I'm sharing it as a highlight of my career, because it sort of opened me up to understanding ideas around creative well-being in a totally different way. It made me appreciate why I'm in the arts in a different way and what it can mean for community. So I share it because in that it's close to my heart in terms of kind of what it's brought. And then a last example of recent work we've done has been an impact report for Indigenous Fashion Arts, which is a festival that happens in Toronto, which I'm incredibly proud of. It's an incredible celebration of Indigenous past, present, future ways of doing within the arts. And just, I was blown away experiencing it. Not last summer, but the summer before. And they hired us in just to help them show the impact that the arts can make from an economic, a cultural, and a social standpoint. And so it was a really beautiful, inspiring celebration. That's also creating a whole generation of fashion artists within the Indigenous communities by bringing them together in conversation. So this is a more recent project I wanted to kind of end on. So yeah, that's the presentation and the information people often get, when I'm presenting work or explaining my business. And what I'd like to do is also kind of take the opportunity, now that I've shown you kind of the front door, to take you inside the back door and share some of the experiences over the years that have happened and the circuitous path I've been on to get here. So I studied philosophy in university and an art history degree. My family was deeply concerned by those choices. I moved to London to do my art history degree. And my father was just like, "Are you going to be an auctioneer?" Sort of pausing, really worried. I was attracted to those fields because I just like thinking holistically and making unexpected connections. It was a really kind of inspiring way of opening up thinking, and that's why I kind of entered there. And then when I was living in London as a student struggling, I got an unpaid internship at the Tate working on an art prize called the Turner Prize. And I foolishly thought to myself, I'll just make myself indispensable in this unpaid job and surely someone will hire me. And it actually ended up working out. It was a bizarre set of circumstances. I didn't even have the right visa to apply for the job posting when the job posting came up. But they didn't find anyone else who could suit the role either, so they turned it into a temporary, part-time, more junior contract. And then I ended up working at the Tate for 6 years and eventually ended up becoming the head of interpretation. And while I was there, I was tasked with making art accessible to a wider range of publics. Basically, it was the task of thinking about ways of creating entry points into complicated information. So it's kind of work I do today, but in a different context. And then for personal reasons, for health reasons, personal reasons, my spouse had some health issues. He was working as a consultant in London alongside me, and he was under 30 and started having heart issues, actually. And I think the energy of that city, which charged me, was depleting for him. So we decided to move back to Canada, and we settled in Toronto. And I thought long and hard. I remember lying on my floor meditating, trying to figure out what to do next. And I wondered, should I go to the AGO or find another art museum and keep doing what I was doing? But I kind of felt like I was ready for a different chapter. and a different kind of moment. And so I decided to work at Bruce Mau Design, which is a design and innovation studio that's based in Toronto but works globally. And it was such a difference in pace. I mean, I ended up a project manager, so I ended up writing contracts, negotiating budgets, working within the creative field. There were some really surreal experiences, which included, going to one of Oprah Winfrey's last TV shows and interviewing people for a project to rebrand Harpo Studios. And I felt so bad because everybody in the green room thought that they were going to get one of those elaborate prizes from my interview, and all they were going to get was helping us on a branding process. But it was a surreal experience, and I was only there for 2 or 3 years at Bruce Mau Design. But in that time, I learned how to be an entrepreneur. Bruce is the kind of visionary designer, and he moved to Chicago, and so we had these 2 teams in that studio. And basically, I was just told you have to sell work and run projects, and so I did, and through trial and error and through learning from others. I slowly started to understand contract negotiations and scoping work and deliverables and running margins. And it felt like a real training ground for becoming an entrepreneur. And then Bruce left Bruce Mau Design, which felt like a weird moment for me. It's like Willy Wonka leaving the chocolate factory, but the chocolate factory is still running. It's now still in good hands, actually, but at the time it felt like a shift and a change. And the business at Bruce Mau Design, which did a lot of work in education and in the arts, shifted a little bit more into commercial branding. And for me, it just didn't really feel right. And so I felt this this need for change stirring up in me, which led me to this slide. So is this what success looks like? I literally had this moment. I was flying on a plane, business class. My spouse was flown over as well to enjoy a 5-star hotel experience in Puerto Rico that was being led by incredibly affluent New York real estate investors who we stayed with for the week to experience the hotel experience that we were going to help brand. And I on the flight home, just took in the experience and was thinking, if I was a different person, this might be this dream moment where I was like, I've made it. Look, this is literally the Ritz Reserve that I was on, by the way. It's like a screen grab of the now opened kind of 5-star hotel that we were meant to brand. And I thought, if I was somebody else, I would be so excited by this opportunity. And it was a large contract, but I felt really constricted and hollowed and constrained by it. And it just didn't align with the kind of place where I wanted to put my energy into. And I have no disrespect for people, who work well within luxury brand hotels. But it just wasn't part of my DNA. And I felt, I had that, I may be going to reveal my age, I'm 46, but I had this, it's like a Carrie Bradshaw moment on the plane where I think about the scene, if any of you have seen Sex and the City, where she's supposed to marry Aiden, and she's in this wedding dress, and it's beautiful, and all she wants to do is just rip off the wedding dress. And I had that imagery in my head on this plane flying home. And then, when I got back with my spouse, my partner, I was like, look, I think I need to quit my job. And it was kind of one of those oh no, and so I negotiated a $500,000 contract for this project for the company and tried to leave on the best possible terms. And before I left, I laid my cards on the table with them. So I would sometimes do small arts projects for Bruce Mau Design on top of my project management, project director job. And so I laid my cards on the table and I said, I really want to work on projects that are about art and culture, that are about community, that are about committing to public good. And they were like, we appreciate that and understand it, but that's not sustainable as a business model for us, and that's not sustainable as a part of your role, in this business. So that was the moment I decided to start my own business. And we parted ways, amiably, and I still collaborate with them on things as well. But it kind of shifted things for me, and I started having to figure out, how do you build a business that can be sustainable doing these things that people say you can't make enough profit on to live off of. And so that became the journey of the business that I've shared with you. So the very first thing I did when I quit my job was, and my husband was incredibly supportive, so that was helpful. He was like, take 6 months and just, figure out what you're going to do. So the first thing I did was I tried to build a like-minded network of people. So I reached out to everybody I knew who I thought was interesting or who might have overlaps with where my interests were. And I asked them all for advice. I interviewed them. I actually created a presentation for myself. I speak in decks. So I created a presentation for myself, sharing back the advice they gave me about what I needed to do. And every time I met somebody, I asked them to introduce me to 2 other people, if I could, just to kind of keep things going. And I started noticing patterns emerging in their feedback. And I started to believe maybe it could be possible if I design something small and lean and purposeful, I can do this. And so I co-founded and incorporated a business using a collective model to pursue big projects. So along the journey of meeting people, I met 3 incredible women, and we decided maybe we should do this together. We're all in similar places of being in jobs that just didn't feel like quite the right fit, weren't really shining with our values. So we decided to go for it. And actually, I remember we incorporated officially on the back of winning a big project together. And our thinking was if we had a brand like Bespoke, we could pursue larger projects, because in the marketplace we were working in, it was mostly singular consultants. And sometimes it can be really hard to have that level of trust as an individual. But for whatever reason, when you kind of create a brand in a business, there's more of a sense of scale to that. So we were like, we will build this umbrella for ourselves and we'll try to sell larger projects together, was kind of the agreed thing. And so we landed a larger project, which was our first ever project, the feasibility study for a Songwriters Hall of Fame. And so it started off with so much excitement. There was 4 of us. We were a collective, non-hierarchical structure of, powerful, wonderful women. What could possibly go wrong? That was sort of the line we were sinking into. It was tough, would be what I would say. And one of the things I really learned from that process is so all of these people I had experience working with on projects, and we effectively and successfully worked together on projects. We collaborated. Collaborating on a business and collaborating on a project are 2 really different kinds of ways of connecting and partnering, was the thing that I learned from that. So there was, and this is an image of the Songwriters Hall of Fame we sketched it, by the way, but there was failures and successes in this collective model. I think the biggest success of it was it kind of gave us a little bit of courage to feel a bit bigger than ourselves and to pursue bigger projects. And so I'm so grateful. And if I had to go back in time, I would still, take this step. The challenges were numerous. First off, we were all in different life stages. So when we started it, we were in our early 30s, everything was possible. And then I had 2 kids, and then things felt more serious after that. My time felt more serious. Whereas some of my other partners, were working part-time, teaching, kind of still in an earlier or a different stage in their life journey in terms of where they were headed. We had different commitment levels. So I had these 2 boys, they're awesome, but then I was laser focused on my business and the energy I was putting into my business, because I just didn't have the bandwidth to do anything else. I needed to focus on the one thing, that was my career. But then my career is connected all of a sudden to 3 other careers, which is complicated. We had different financial goals as well. So for me, I wanted to be able to support my family through my business entirely and be financially sustainable through my business. Some of my partners were doing teaching, they were writing books, they were doing other kinds of projects, working part-time somewhere else. Initially, that didn't matter when we were pursuing a big project together, but it started to matter when we were shifting into creating something that was a solid foundation for a business. And all of a sudden, it feels a little bit awkward to say to someone, I think you should quit, like this or that, so you can put more time into this unpaid vanity project I'm working on with you. The other challenge we faced was seniority. That was another challenge in that we were all kind of mid-career and pretty seasoned and experienced with really great expertise. But the the margins in arts and culture aren't particularly forgiving, and so they're not enormous budgets starting off. So it was really hard to share, which meant that we all had a big burden if we wanted to come together to financially bring in new business on an ongoing basis. So things start feeling really serious at that point. And then the other and most jarring difference I can remember was we made decisions really, really differently, like really differently. My three other partners went to architecture school, and they're all brilliant and mostly analytical, kind of beautiful minds, and very rational, and sort of take in information, process it, let it sit with them for a bit, and then thoughtfully have a conversation. When we were sitting around a table negotiating things, I am basically making decisions, snapping my fingers before I can speak the words when I'm hearing something. So we would sit in these meetings, these planning meetings together around my dining table, and we actually had Post-it notes that we hid under like a painting near my fireplace, planning things out. And I felt so impatient almost with people's decision-making processes, especially, when you're 4 people, you can spend 3 hours on an administration meeting talking about how you process invoices. And I just felt like I didn't have enough time to give people the space to catch up with the decisions that I wanted to make. So it was a great learning experience. And once we landed our first sizable project together, so we had a few smaller projects that went maybe 2 or 3 years, and then we landed another sizable project. I wanted to take on an office space as well at that point. And so we just had a conversation, over drinks, and 2 of the partners agreed to kind of just walk away and still collaborate with us on projects and shift from collaborators to business partners. So, exciting times. We land big projects. It's the Bentway, by the way. You can see the little yellow board. This is our first office in Liberty Village, and this is myself and my remaining partner working away in our office. So excited and so in sync. So out of all the partners, she's absolutely brilliant as a person, but also kind of met my level of intensity in terms of work, and was at a similar place in her life stages as well. So we could kind of appreciate each other's priorities. And we worked really well together creatively. So we felt like we were well on the path to success. And then another unexpected twist. My partner's partner needs to move to Newfoundland. He's just received the offer of a lifetime in terms of a career teaching, and he needs to move to Newfoundland. And of course, this is pre-pandemic as well, so we're like not as welcoming of these long distance dreams at this point. And for about 2 years, we try to make it work, doing things long distance, running a business. But it's really difficult at this time. Most of our clients are based in Toronto, which means that anytime anybody needs to show up at a meeting, I need to be the one there. And so it creates an imbalance that's really difficult, and we become very good friends at this point too. So it takes us 2 years for us to part ways as a business, and I buy her out eventually. And I always think about it as like the Gwyneth Paltrow, Chris Martin moment of like conscious uncoupling. Like it just took forever. There were like moments and tears on planes and conversations, and it was a really difficult decision. One that I still think about a lot, and I have a lot of regrets about in terms of some of the tensions that emerged and things like that. But she's an absolutely incredible person, and I still work with her today, actually. She's a core collaborator for me, and an incredible person to work with. But yeah, then there were one. So then I'm on my own. I'm a solo entrepreneur. I finally hire a small staff, and then I land a large project, Waterfront Toronto, which is the revitalization of the waterfront along Lake Ontario. And I end up needing to manage over 120 projects in 5 years for this one client. Everything you can imagine, we did. So we did, you can see these are public engagement pictures. We helped in 2 weeks plan the announcement for the Google Sidewalk Labs project, which you can see on the stage at the time, helping write the Q&As last minute in a flurry. We created videos and communication campaigns. Anything you can almost think of from a communications public engagement standpoint, we did with Waterfront Toronto. But it was a journey to kind of be owning the business, have one other person working next to me, and then managing probably, I would say we worked with at least 50 people over the course of this project, and probably 20 pretty considerably in the first year. So that was all-consuming, I would say, and there was a bit of a crunchy point with my family, if I'm being honest. It was really hard to kind of balance, giving to my family. My husband also runs his own business, so we joke that each of our businesses are like the children we love, but we don't love their child, and so we constantly have conflict over time commitments and who can be there. And this was the moment where the business felt like a business and I was running it on my own. But at that point, desperately wishing I had more resources as well. So it's one of those ironies, after you kind of go through those transitions as a business. And then there was like another wave of change, I think worth sharing as my backstory over the pandemic. And I'm sure many of you have various COVID stories, but I ended up getting rid of our office, was one of the things that happened. I had this beautiful 1,000 square foot office in Liberty Village, and I was sitting in it alone for like 2 years, wondering if I could have paid off my mortgage by now if I had gotten rid of it. So I ended up getting rid of the office. And then I also ended up becoming a lot more aware of mental health over the course of the pandemic. And if any of you have kids, I had the experience of having them online for almost a year, and it really impacted them in a serious way. There was, challenges around depression, anxiety. One of my sons got diagnosed with ADHD. So I became increasingly aware of mental health issues and the importance of caring in a different way. And it shifted my attitude towards work, I think, at this point, to this day. So I used to be kind of one of those people who would, just drink a cup of coffee and make it work at 2 a.m. kind of energy. I've always been kind of, welcoming with the people that I work with, but also had high expectations for our work together. And I think the pandemic shifted that a bit. And I actually now think I care more about the people I work with than the projects now after the pandemic. That's kind of one of the changes that's happened for me. And so one of the colleagues I work with has health issues, maybe 6 months ago was meant to come present something that she'd been leading on. But she was feeling unwell. And so, I was almost in that pattern, that moment of, come on, jump on the plane and just come. And instead, I told her to stay home, and I went in person, and, we presented with her remotely. And so I feel like the pandemic kind of opened up some of that awareness around other people's mental health and the responsibility we have to care for others as businesses. And then the other thing that arose is my son was diagnosed with ADHD. And through that, I found out that I also have ADHD, which was not surprising. We were reading so much for my son, and then my husband started sending me articles about adult ADHD on Instagram, and I was just like, yeah. And then I started reading them and realized that there are some wonderful strengths to having ADHD, but also there are some challenges. So once that diagnosis came through, I also started shifting how I staffed my business. And I actually realized my staff and my team, my core team, who are permanent staff, need to support where my weaknesses are, actually. And so I had a kind of, prior to that, I'd often hire people who I wanted to mentor, who kind of like reflected some of the creative energy that I have and bring. So kind of that mirroring was happening before. And then I realized, no, I need somebody super organized, somebody who's on the deadline, somebody who has an eye for detail and attention. So that really shifted how I build my team. And it's been so much better over the last 2 years, now that I have a better understanding of some of my weaknesses. as well as some of my strengths, but that was jarring. And the little picture on the bottom is I have an office cabin built in my house now in the backyard. So I got rid of the office, which is absolutely lovely and quite cozy. Yeah, and then today, now, then the kind of next chapter for 2024 is wanting to focus on a lot of the work I do is responsive to people's needs, and it's kind of in response to a big change happening. And so the shift I'm working towards now as a business is really focusing on how I can bring conversations together and how I can proactively design ways of engaging people in an interesting way. So coming out, with different ways of, say, strategic planning. So this is Culture Tarot, which I'm going to be launching in 2024. And it's identified 7 critical issues, I think, for strategic planning for arts organizations. And the thinking behind Culture Tarot is to shake out of the consulting speak and the jargon and the need to kind of have that level of formality in how we plan for the future and build organizations, and instead kind of tap into the creativity that is innate within arts organizations. Too many times working in the arts, I see people kind of ascribing or getting subsumed by this kind of business jargon speak, when it's like, no, you have like this beautiful creative art heart. Why aren't we focusing our energy on that as the basis for our planning together? So yeah, I'll be launching this in 2024. I've been working on it literally for years since the pandemic. And my hope is it'll be the first in a series of offerings that we design proactively, that we put out into the world, and that kind of change the conversation, hopefully in new ways, and push people into not feeling like they have to be so narrowly boxed into, different kinds of business models and consulting paradigms to achieve success. So that's my hope. So I feel like I've been talking a long time. I hope we're doing okay. But I thought as the last chapter to this, what I would do is share some life lessons that I've taken away. Some of them are based in work. They all serve me in work, but some of them are so vital. They actually also bleed into my personal life and are just the way that things have been done. Some of them might connect with you. I hope they do. And it was really fun, I have to say, to kind of reflect on what actually does work, within the madness of what I've created over the last 12 years. So my first life lesson, and you might have been getting an inkling of the sentiment from how I've been speaking so far, is just don't be afraid to innovate your business model. Don't be I've always defined myself as a creative person, and I bring so much creative energy to the projects that I do. But actually, it took me a long time to give myself permission to also innovate how I do business and how I talk about that to other people. It took me a really long time, and I think it's only in the last 2 years that I felt confident enough to speak to it. When I started Bespoke, I had this image in my mind of like one of those swishy Google offices, where there's like hordes of people. There's some weird, cool like light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. There's like a large staff and these creative co-op spaces, and we'd all be hustling and bustling. We'd be working intense hours through the weekend. We'd be traveling and flying on planes all the time. And I would be this kind of leadership oversight person watching Keebler elves do incredible things. But actually, I realized that I was told that story, that was what my success journey was supposed to be. But it hasn't ended up that way. And I don't think I've actually wanted it to end up that way. But it took me a while to articulate what my business model is. And I often tell people it's kind of like Tetris meets Robin Hood is how I describe my business model. So Tetris, because it's like flexible, it's scalable, and it's nimble. I have a really small team with small overhead, but I also have all the organizational needs in place to take on big projects. So I have like $5 million of insurance. I have all the paperwork required to work with different cities and towns. I have subcontractor agreements set in place and processes to allow me to take on a really large public sector project with no problem. And then I now have a project manager I work with. And so what we do is once we have a project come in, we use that as the basis for defining the best possible team. So we just try to get the best Tetris pieces and blocks together to put a proposal out for that project. And so my process and my business model is project-centered and it's passion-centered. I don't take on projects that you don't put on your website or you hide. Too often I hear about you've got to pay the bills and then you also have to, do some interesting things to talk about. I want everything I do to be something I can put on my website and speak to with pride. And if I can't speak to it, then maybe I shouldn't be doing it. Is kind of my sentiment around that. So the passion is really important. And when I'm thinking about those Tetris pieces, I imagine them as both Swiss Army knives and scalpels. So in my mind, you need both Swiss Army knives and scalpels as collaborators to do things effectively. So the Swiss Army knives are the get her done kind of people that, just know how to push through. They're the drivers. They're the ones who just, regardless of what they're doing, they can find a way to make it work. And they kind of have a quick and nimble mind where they can kind of, operate at a couple of places and bring them together to keep things moving. So I am more of a Swiss Army knife, full disclosure, than a scalpel. But I work a lot with scalpels because there are these people in the world who have these beautiful gifts and expertise. And I work with artists, I work with curators, I work with architects, urban planners, designers of all kinds, thought leaders, and it's kind of sustainability experts. It's just like finding that thing that makes them sing and bringing it into a project so that you can really deliver something that you can be proud of after. Yeah, and then the other thing to say is that each team is its own unique little pod. So I have these co-collaborative teams, and it's like a little universe of projects. So I've got 5 or 6 Tetris games happening at the same time for my business model, which I'm happy with. Sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming, and sometimes I kind of push and take on too many projects, which is probably the most challenging aspect of it. And initially, I used to hide that I was doing this. I used to think I was an imposter, or they're going to find out I only have 2 people in this room, and they're going to take the project away, especially with larger government contracts. But interestingly, post-pandemic, people really are resonating now. If anyone's interested in this kind of a model, lean, scalable, lower risk financially, that is connecting not only with entrepreneurs, but with the clients as well, because they don't want to have the kind of risk of taking on too much infrastructure or too much overhead. So that idea of nimbleness and, at the drop of a hat, being able to find the perfect videographer for Waterfront Toronto on one of their 120 projects is a kind of skill that really is, I think, valued at this point. And so if you can find your network, it can be a really enormous asset, I would say, for sure. So I've slowly come around to, accepting this kind of Tetris model as my model. And then I didn't put Robin Hood on there, but when I mentioned I do large projects and small projects, I sometimes have people coming to me that are artist-run centers that have a really limited grant budget. And I take on those projects if I believe in them, and I hope not to lose money on them, but put the energy into them that it takes to deliver something great, trying to kind of navigate delicately what's possible within that. And so I try to, I take on some of those small projects at the same time as I'm taking on these big projects. And I have different rates for both of those projects. So I have public sector rates within government, which helps me kind of stay financially sustainable. And then I have lower rates for arts and not-for-profit organizations, which allows me to sometimes lean into meaningful work, even if there's limits on the budget. So that seems to be working for me. The ebb and flow and the balance of it, is challenging. And it is kind of amazing to be having, you have a 16-person team Zoom call with 400 people joining a Zoom event. And then you're talking to the executive director and their operations manager at a 2-person cultural organization, helping them kind of launch what they're doing. And so I really love that variety. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. So life lesson number 2, tap into creativity by listening with all your senses. I do this for every project I do, the little ones and the big ones. And when I talk about your senses, there's some basic things we do as a business. So for me, listening to community voices is always incredibly important. And having conversations with people, doing interviews with people connected to a project is really important. Best practice examples, so doing desk research, of course, you should do your desk research, and you should look at examples of things you aspire to, and work up to those and take elements that can work for you from them. And then data analysis too. There's tons of information, so many reports, so much information, data visualizations at our fingertips. All of these things, are a part of designing a beautiful project. But I feel like the stuff we don't talk about is our feelings and our memories and our intuitions sometimes, and how those can shape our experiences and inspire us. So I think it's okay when you're tapping into your creativity to find it in an unexpected place for an expected project. So I also look to the kind of popular culture of the moment to see what's happening. What are my kids talking about? What's the new word in the Oxford Dictionary that's emerging? All of those kinds of things matter too. And then our personal lived experiences too. I've come to the point where I'm unapologetic, where something quirky happens in my personal life and it translates into something beautiful in a project. So I think sometimes we don't think about just how many ways in which we can tap into our creativity, and recognizing the mind is actually just one sense. It's one way of tapping into things, thinking. But we can look at visuals, we can look at sounds, we could taste things, touch them, smell them. We have our ideas. And I feel like that kind of interdisciplinary, multifaceted way of experiencing the world and opening our creativity up is how you get to something that can be greater than the sum of its parts. And it's how you can kind of just nudge things to the next level. And whenever I do a project, I try to go really broad, in terms of what the possibilities are, but also deep and focused in it. And so that research piece that's like on paper is the deep part, but then there's the intangible part I often don't talk about when I'm presenting to clients, and it's where the most curious and interesting ideas sometimes come from. So I encourage you to listen to those, when those opportunities arise for your projects. And I wanted to share one project example of that happening, which is we recently did an exhibition at the AGO for Mount Sinai Hospital's 100-year anniversary. And this is a kind of, I'm not sure if you can see it well, but it's sort of like a detail. One of the rooms in Mount Sinai needed to tell the story of different buildings, the different buildings they've built and the hospital's grown into over the years. So the evolution of the hospital and its footprint. There's nothing I hate more than a blueprint of a building in a frame. And I just had that moment when we were designing the exhibition of thinking, I just don't want this to be another map nobody looks at and walks by. There's a humanity and a heart to the hospital, but it's just not coming across. The people inside aren't coming across. And I just let kind of creativity and inspiration take me in an unexpected place. There was somebody I was following on Instagram who actually has a studio in Prince Edward County. And she's an amazing artist, and she made a pop-up work. And I posted the pop-up work because I just loved it. And it was this kind of like beautiful art piece where you opened up these panels and this kind of almost like black and white floral nature scene emerged in pop-up. And it was just one of those moments of inspiration, totally disconnected from this project. And then we just had a moment when we were brainstorming where we thought, what if instead of putting these maps in cases, we created pop-ups of the buildings? And so what we ended up doing was designing these almost like 6-foot book pop-ups, pop-up books for kids, where you could kind of open the book and then the building pops up, which you can kind of see on the bottom. But then inside you could explore and look at different rooms and see different stories. They did things in the coat room, for instance. They performed some of the first surgeries. So we have a little story and you can kind of peek into the coat room. So just letting that kind of creativity and curiosity infuse your work, I think, for me at least, has been beneficial and just inspiring. All right, life lesson number 3. And this is a life lesson I think I knew earlier than starting my business. Know that almost everything is negotiable. I believe that, and I mean, it's surprising sometimes because I work with so many government organizations who have very kind of process-driven, tried and true ways of doing things. But in my life, I've learned that almost everything is negotiable. And I've put a photograph of my dog up there with me, and that's Otis, who I love to pieces. And this is him and I hanging out in Parkdale, Toronto. And I take him into almost every shop on Queen Street, which my husband doesn't believe. And when we go into the shops with the dog, he's like, "You can't bring the dog in here." And I'm like, "Of course we can bring the dog in here. It will be fine." But it was the kind of most natural personal example I could share with you of knowing that everything is negotiable. And of course I'm respectful when I'm bending a rule or a boundary. And I'm checking in with the shop before I'm bringing the dog in, of course. But over the years, the dog and I basically go everywhere. We have free reign on Queen Street from a personal standpoint. And so that's just an example of having an assumption in place that there's a certain way of doing things. But often there's wiggle room if you ask for it. But you have to ask nicely for the wiggle room, in my experience. So this kind of asking why when something's not allowed nicely and pushing the boundary as much as you can is something I do in my work all the time to try to make things better. Because if we don't nudge things, we won't get past the kind of repetition of where we're at now. And I've made a list. I was trying to think, what do I negotiate in my business? I've negotiated my tax deadlines. I've negotiated banking and the restrictions and limits on banking on an ongoing basis through a phone call and just talking to somebody. I've negotiated insurance policies. I've negotiated tons of complicated contracts, that seem like they have immovable kind of, untouchable rules to them. And it, for instance, like the amount of insurance coverage you need, and just having that conversation and saying, well, why is it that way? We're not doing this kind of work, and having the back and forth. We've negotiated timelines so many times, I can't count them. Fees, processes, project deliverables, but also structures and hierarchy in places, encouraging people to maybe have different decision makers at the table, for instance. Negotiating entrenched systems too, and ways of doing things, like outdated approaches to reports, and negotiating decision making. So that's just kind of some of the expansive things that I'm so grateful that I come into projects and I come into situations asking why something is the way it is, and can we change it? And what's the risk? If we change it, what do you have to lose? And it's not about change for change's sake, but if you see an opportunity for something to be a little bit better or to make your work a bit better, in my experience, I've been surprised by the amount of times there has been an appetite for change when there's a little bit of kindness in the ask. So that definitely is a life lesson that I'm grateful for. Life lesson number 4 is just to bring generosity and care to every relationship. That is a huge one for me, and maybe it sounds a bit goofy or kind of overly heartfelt, but I want everybody that I work with to feel welcomed into a space that I'm with as our starting point, and I want to be thoughtful about those connections and relationships as much as possible and show my appreciation for them. So one thing I've kind of discovered over the years is that my business really is my community. And all of those conversations I talked to you about that I had like 13 years ago when I was trying to figure out what I was doing, a lot of them are still in the mix all the time, and they have kind of expanded and exploded. And anytime I get asked to write a reference letter, do an interview for somebody, make an introduction, I always try to prioritize doing those things for other people, because I just believe that if we support others, they'll support us. And I want to kind of foster that kind of environment for my network as much as possible. And then the hope is that there's reciprocity in that. So from my standpoint as a business owner, almost all of my business comes from word of mouth. Even when I'm pitching large RFPs for government projects, somebody knows somebody who picks up the phone and kind of sends me the RFP and invites me to pitch for it. Or, it's that kind of a dynamic. So there's always somebody who knows somebody do you remember when you met? She said, how do we know each other? And so I often get these emails about updating my website, actually, as we were looking at your SEO and you really need to update your website. The search terms have you low down on the Google engine and nobody will find you. And I'm sure there's some truth to that, but I am not trying to sell 3 million products of a thing. I'm actually trying to work on projects that I find engaging, and so in that way, those relationships are where that comes through. And so when I think about my community, I think about my staff, but I also think about my collaborators and colleagues. I think about interns and partners and clients. I think about even generosity with competitors as well, and recognizing it's not, we don't have to always operate within a scarcity model as well, and we can support each other. And sometimes there might be a project that's just not the right fit for me. And that kind of kindness or, just connecting that client to somebody who's a competitor can be mutually beneficial, for everybody concerned. So there's that kind of energy that can happen. And my community is also my mentors and thought leaders and neighbors too. And so I think just every relationship in our personal lives and our professional lives has that potential. And I work with a lot of friends as well, as part of my business model, which sometimes can be tough when you have to have those tough questions, but it's also deeply rewarding because it just makes it a lot easier to be supportive in those environments. And so I'm enormously grateful for those relationships, and without my relationships, I wouldn't have a business. It's a weird business model. So it's it's not the easiest thing to explain or to invite people into. So I live off of those relationships, and in return, I try to give to them as much as I can. Life lesson number 5 is define success in your own terms. And I'd also say remember that success changes, in those life stage moments that I was talking about a bit. It can evolve over time. It can change. The way you were thinking about success 2 years ago might not be the way you were thinking about it now, and that's okay. But as an entrepreneur, I think there's something to be said about asking yourself, what does my success mean to me? And what am I talking about when I say success? When do I get that gut feeling in my body that is yes, that kind of we did it moment. And I feel we kind of have to put some thoughtfulness and some care into that for ourselves. We deserve to. So what does success mean to me? You probably have picked up it's embracing new ways of doing, but it's also having a positive impact through the work I do, believing that I'm doing that. I think if I didn't believe that, I would stop running my own business. I also selfishly want to feel creatively inspired in the work that I do and do interesting work. I also want to have a professional life and a family life. So that's been something that's more recent, actually. I used to be somebody who just threw myself into my work. But since we've started a family over the years, I've recognized the importance of also making time and space for self-care, for my family, for being there. And the kind of flexibility that entrepreneurship offers is really wonderful, in that you can kind of go back and forth between those things. And then success for me is also comfortably supporting my family financially. So that's another important constraint. Money is also important, and I acknowledge that as well. But have a different relationship, I think, to profit than businesses that are profit-driven. So life lesson number 6. I encourage you to celebrate collaboration over ownership. And I've had some interesting conversations with myself about what ownership means over the years as well, and how that comes out. And there have been many moments where you have I have such a great idea about this thing that's happening in culture. And then somebody else, does a thing, gives a talk or whatever on that idea. And you're like, oh, that was my idea. I want it back, and there's that kind of feeling of just, I missed that opportunity, that kind of sense of loss that can sometimes happen. And so I've been working on that feeling a lot and trying to reframe it as much as possible. And I've been thinking, like, can you own an original idea? Can you own a project? Can you own a person? Can you own an outcome as an individual? We have this, or I have this image of like the Albert Einstein genius kind of imprinted in Western culture, where it's this idea that, there's one person can be this kind of like, full, sort of like unique genius thinker who holds all of originality and original thought, in their being. The reality is it isn't like that, and that so many incredible ideas have been thought over the years. In 2023, it feels like at best we're a footnote on one of those ideas for a moment in time, and 40 million other people are thinking it when you're doing it anyways. So I've tried to kind of pull back from that idea of originality a little bit and just recognize like thought leadership is more about how you bring things together, the conversations you bring together and those kinds of things, less about that spark, that magical spark that's like a kind of fleeting one-off myth at best, mostly for white men anyways. So, the other thing, I've thought about when it comes to ownership is collaboration exclusivity. So as a flexible and nimble business, I've had a lot of collaborators I work with. There was a moment where I was nervous about the bespoke brand, and I was like, we need to get everybody business cards that are bespoke business cards, and this is a bespoke project. Everybody needs to know it's a bespoke project. And then I soon realized actually it's an outdated way of thinking from my perspective. And there's one competitor within the arts and culture planning space who requires that any collaborators sign an exclusivity agreement with them. So they'll only work, in that industry with them. And I have decided to not do that. And actually, so I've 180'd on that kind of approach. And nobody has bespoke business cards but me, not even my staff, actually. And then in addition to that, when collaborators come in, I try to give them as much credit as I can as being a collaborator, make really clear their expertise at the end of the project. And if they want to work with somebody who is competing, an ongoing competitor with me, I'm absolutely cool with that as long as we have clear lines of communication and clarity around the project we're working on together. So I think that's been a real learning curve for me. Project recognition as well. So initially I was kind of like, I've got to hold on to this to show I can do big projects. And then it's like, no, actually, I can show that I can manage this big team of incredible people. And that is one of the skill sets that I bring. And the network and it's almost like once you celebrate other businesses working with you, you amplify each other's success, and you can kind of just show all those incredible layers coming together, which is, just such an incredible offering with so much more kind of expertise at hand. And then the other kind of place around ownership that can get touchy too is client relationships, right, as well. And you have a client, you introduce the client to somebody, you do some work together. Are they still your client? That moment and that feeling again of wanting ownership for a moment. But actually putting myself in check, I think, over the years and just recognizing, that we go through phases of working with different clients and they work with different businesses, and it's advantageous for me if those businesses are people who I collaborate with. It keeps those kind of lines of network open. So I really do think at this point, celebrating collaboration as a business, knowing what value you bring, but also that part of your value is being a connector is really critical. And if framed in the right way, people, I think, respond to it really positively. And no more original ideas. It's just how you bring things together. I think a lot of people come to me because they know who I am as a person and the kind of energy that I bring to a project, and they appreciate that and they need it. And if they need something else, then I have the utmost respect for them wanting to go out and get that something else. Life lesson number 7, last life lesson, we're almost through, is just lead by wearing your heart on your sleeve. I had this idea at the beginning of starting my own business that I needed to wear a lot of black turtlenecks and kind of be a little bit more composed in my demeanor and polished, and maybe hold back my expressions, which is impossible. I'm jazz hands all the time, which you could probably notice when I'm talking, so it's not going to happen. So I've tried to really shift and recognize that there's value in leading with your heart on your sleeve and being really honest about the person you are. And that doesn't mean being unprofessional. There's still kind of courtesies within a professional environment that we adhere to make people feel comfortable. But it's also an open space for being a real person who has an identity and has an energy that they bring, and sharing that. So yeah, my last life lesson that I wish I had told myself sooner is just shine as your real self professionally. And this close-up is a picture of me at the airport. I have I have a habit of buying a lot of bold patterns, and I was on a work trip and I realized I was wearing 3 or 4 very bold patterns overlaid in opposition to that black turtleneck vibe and energy that I thought maybe should be what I should be doing. But I now embrace my pattern clashing ways. I'm sorry I'm not more colorful today for you all. I typically am. And I share my passions with my clients too. I share the things that bring me energy. In conversation, I take the time to check in with team and with clients about how their day is going, what they're up to, what they're interested in. I show care for others. I advocate for a healthy work environment when we're on a big project team where that culture might not align with our culture on an ongoing basis, which is often the case, and try to kind of maintain those boundaries and be respectful for people's time and energy. And also, I am open to being vulnerable and sharing with people when it's a bad day, if something goes wrong, and recognizing that that there's a lot of complexity and different emotions that pass through us in a day, and we can be open about how we feel in a work environment, and that's okay. We don't have to hide the kids away from the Zoom screen, which I sometimes still do if it's a government call and they're crawling on my chair, which recently happened. But for the most part, my family life is also an integral part of who I am, and so that kind of comes with me as a part of the kind of business that I run. So that is kind of the wrap up for this. And so the recap, in terms of life lessons, and I wanted to line them all up so I could see if they made sense, as as a team of ideas. But don't be afraid to innovate your business model. Tap into creativity by listening with all your senses. Know that almost everything's negotiable. Bring generosity and care to every relationship. Define success on your own terms. Celebrate collaboration over ownership, and then lead by wearing your heart on your sleeve. I feel like I've been talking a long time, and I hope it hasn't been too much, but I'm happy to answer any questions or whatever.
So I guess I just want to say that you mentioned the Oxford word of the year in the dictionary. And I recently saw that the 2023 word is authentic. And I feel like that's why I'm so glad to have you today, because that is you. I think to me, as a business owner, you're bringing, as you mentioned, values-led into your business. And I think it's such a great example for people to just be themselves, and that's really what can elevate your business instead of just trying to do what you think you should do. So that's all I wanted to say in terms of thank you for being here, and I have questions, but I would love to open it up to everybody else first if there are any questions.
I do have a question. Who was the first person that you hired?
Oh, good question. It was, you want full-time employee, right? Because I had a lot of subcontracting happening for years and years, and actually it was probably just 5 years ago that I hired a full-time project manager. Okay. It was the first. And then I recently have hired an administrative assistant since my ADHD assessment, which has been kind of amazing.
Yeah, I really like your comment about, you should be trying to hire people that would support your weaknesses, right? And that's kind of where that question sort of stemmed from is, who was your first hire? But thanks for sharing.
Yeah, it was the project management. And again, I had to show the job description to my husband to check. And I was squeezing in creative work into it for them because I think she might she's so And he was like, don't call it a project manager and a strategist. He was like, it's just a project manager. And he helped me kind of focus in the job just to make sure that, yeah, like it hits some of those weaknesses that I have, definitely, yeah.
Do you have any connection to Hastings?
Oh, so my only connection to Hastings is Christine, who I've worked with in the past, but I don't have any current connections to Hastings, no.
So you drove all the way here for the presentation?
I did, yeah. You're very welcome. I took the Via Rail train, I read a book, it was great.
Thank you for your presentation, it's been great. My question is, how do you go about selecting your vendors and your sub-trades and consultants that you work with?
Oh, that's a great question. So often when I get these larger contracts, like I was describing, which are like, say, 3-year public engagement or communication contracts, I will always start with my network. So I'll always start with the relationships I already have, and I'll start to put kind of feelers out with those relationships. But so what I will usually do is, ask, if I'm looking for, say, a videographer, I'll ask the graphic designer I'm working with if they know anybody who might be open. I also have people approaching me for work, and so anytime somebody approaches me for a coffee, I'll always kind of take a coffee, and so try to kind of stay nimble in that way. I do sometimes post the jobs too on Instagram or on LinkedIn, and I go through waves of just meeting people. I realize, because of how these projects get resourced, I need a range of expertise, and so the people I started working with are all pretty senior now, and we actually need kind of like younger, fresh energy as well on projects to kind of keep things, dynamic. And so to do that, I'm constantly trying to make connections and networks. So, I ran a public engagement series in Oakville maybe 2 weeks ago, and we had Sheridan students who were urban planning students volunteer to be scribes for the day, and so I connected with them after that session, and I have my eyes on them, if you know what I mean, for the next round when things come. So I'm always looking for opportunities to expand my network, but it's really informal, and it is word of mouth as much as possible, which is why I'm always so open as well. Anytime somebody makes an introduction, you know what I mean, I never take it for granted, because there's always kind of a reason to. And I do an internship, a paid internship with OCAD on a pretty regular basis too. So I try to also kind of connect with some of the colleges and universities in Toronto through our work whenever there's an opportunity, just to kind of get some fresh energy in there. Yeah.
So what are those attributes and values that you look for in a person to kind of bring them on board?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. It sometimes depends on the project, a little bit. I mean, so it depends if I'm hiring a Swiss Army knife or a scalpel would be like one thing I would say. If I'm hiring a Swiss Army knife, which is somebody who's a little bit more adaptable, who might work on a multiple set of projects with me over the course of time, I think collaboration for me is absolutely critical. Like somebody hardworking, and team player as well, and kind of getting that sense of team player is important. I often also, because of my network, work with a lot of artists, curators, culture producers, who maybe have like a number of side hustles, going on, which I think makes things interesting. So I kind of love that when there's an opportunity to kind of work in that way. But I would say just positivity too is really important to me. I didn't talk about that as a value, but I have a very can-do kind of, I think anything's possible most of the time. And I need a taste of reality on a team, but not too much of it. So I'm also, when I meet somebody, I really want to get a sense of more than what's on their CV in terms of skill sets, especially if it's a more junior role, just that kind of like openness, team player, willing to kind of be flexible, and then like smart and hardworking too, of course, like those kinds of things. And then if I'm hiring a scalpel, then it's really, we might not work together in as deep a way, and so then it might be something, it might be like what fits this project as best as possible. And scalpels can be, I know a gentleman who's a designer who does nothing but design typographic letters. You know what I mean? Like and spends like 16 weeks designing a new font. You know what I mean? And that's like the only thing he does. So as that kind of a collaboration, we're less in the room together, and he kind of goes and does magical things and comes back. And so that is a little bit different. And I leave him with, his creative process can be more differentiated than mine, So I think with the kind of scalpel piece, I do look more for that, the level of expertise and the closeness with which it fits with the project. So it really is important too that it kind of like fits the need. And it's great if we get along really well too. You know what I mean? Like but it's that priority is a little bit lower if that kind of expertise is more specialized and required. And I have, I can generally work with a wide range of personalities, and so that's served me well in that kind of a way. So I can usually kind of get into a good place. But there have been moments that, where things haven't worked out, and that's difficult as well. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Anyone else has a question?
Right behind you.
Hi. I don't know if this is going to be an easy question to answer, and it probably comes down to a bit your personality or your structure, or whatever. But you have defied conventional methods to do things in some ways, and a lot of people would find that very hard to do. I know with ADHD, there's always certain seeking of stimulation, so that might counter that a little bit. But I'm wondering what gave you the strength, or maybe you didn't need the strength, but to define yourself in a world that wanted you to be a certain way?
Oh, I love that question. It's like such a big one. I mean, I've kind of always felt like an odd duck all the time. You know what I mean? So that's not uncommon. Like I just always felt like I was marching to the beat of my own drum. And so there's almost like a personal answer to that, which has always kind of felt that way. And I've tried to resist it at points in my career and at points in my personal life, where you try to kind of just like slip into the normative ideas of what this thing is supposed to look like, but it doesn't feel comfortable and it's not inspiring, and so one of the things that was really critical for me, I think, was I moved to London, England for a year on my own, and I was just by myself for a year in this enormous city that kind of had a higher threshold for anything possible, than I was from Montreal originally. So that really let me experience what it felt like to be more, own who I was a little bit more and be unapologetic about it. And so that kind of, once I got a taste of that, you know what I mean? And then, if I just kind of hold strong on this, you know what I mean? And do it differently, maybe somebody will believe it can be done differently, and so that kind of started, I think it was like the seed of confidence. I professionally started to become myself when I was living in London.
It wasn't about facing fear, it was about being in an environment where you could define yourself as you wanted.
Yeah, I think so. Or having at least a taste of what that's like. And then when we came back to Canada, things did feel more kind of risk averse, a little bit more conservative and constricted, and people wanting to kind of do things in a more methodical and the way things are meant to be done kind of way, at least. And at that point, I just couldn't, I didn't fit, the peg didn't fit anymore, basically. And I felt like I started my own business because I just didn't have a choice. I couldn't find a job that was the job I wanted. I applied for a job as an editor of a magazine, actually, in between starting the business, and they offered me the job. And I went through a bunch of interviews. I was like, I'll just see, maybe I'll be an editor of a magazine, which sounds ridiculous and then they offered the job, and then I was like, oh no, they offered me the job. And then I had to have like a weird job breakup call with them after, and I could feel that like if I was going to leave this thing, which was pretty cool, for this other thing, you know what I mean, that it was just not gonna, not going to make the difference. So I think, I mean, maybe I'm lucky, but it feels like I don't have a choice anymore. So I'm just going with it. Yeah. Thanks.
I have a question sort of in line. Did you face any, like, I guess, barriers or adversity in your personal life, like with your spouse? Kind of, it sounds like you're aligned, sort of doing the same thing, but is he gone in the same trajectory as you have?
Interesting.
Like, does he operate the same way as you? Or do you guys?
We don't collaborate, let me tell you. There's like enough co-parenting to last 2 lifetimes in that marriage. I sometimes joke we should collaborate, and he's like, my husband, I mean, he's awesome. Super organized, super thoughtful, super methodical, does things very precisely, worked in a large consulting environment, and does change management with large organizations. So really kind of different sort of business expertise than mine. He's been really supportive of me as an entrepreneur, so I've been really lucky about that. And I've tried to be really supportive of him when he started his own business, which he did maybe at 5 years after I started mine. So there's been that kind of, we don't do collaborations in the work environment. We have some tension. I would say, around like balancing family life with businesses and business priorities, and like whose meeting is more important over the pandemic, you know what I mean? And my husband actually is the one who is less ruthless with meetings than I am. So when he asks, it's rare that he asks me to like, he's like, I really need you to, because I can get so intense in my work that I feel like it's the end of the world a little bit if I can't do it. And I would say the barriers I faced, like as an entrepreneur, I think as a creative woman, negotiating contracts probably, and like financial negotiations in particular, is one of the biggest gaps that I do see and I have to advocate for, and is an ongoing challenge. I think the arts and culture sector is already grossly underpaid. So, I mean, that's its own scarcity issue. But when I work on public sector projects, I do see a lot of pushback on rates. And I have comparable examples of other businesses and counterparts who don't see those same challenges. So I try my best, to kind of stick to my guns, and I just try to use information like data, based on industry standards as much as possible when that happens.
So we have one last question, and then if anyone has questions after, then I'm sure Christina will be happy to answer them later.
Sure. Yeah, I have 2, but I'll ask the first one and maybe we can chat afterwards. And sorry, I just missed that, so I don't know if this was relevant at all. So I work with clients, we do a lot of value-based stuff, and it's clear that, values are a big part of what you do as well. I'm just really curious as to how that translates to KPIs. Do you have any sort of value-based KPIs?
No, I don't hold myself to KPIs at all, although I help clients come up with them. It's like one of those curses where I do communications, say for like a project, and then our communication is always delayed. It's it is an interesting kind of piece for me to think about for sure, which I don't give enough attention to. Yeah, that's a good question.
It's something I really wrestle with because I work with people and, you've got the traditional KPIs, but when you work with values, something I'm just personally struggling with, like helping people coming up with values-based KPIs. So I wondered if you had any insights into it.
I do debriefs with clients when projects go well or badly. Like maybe that is and with our team members after the project. So maybe that's the closest to like a kind of soft skill KPI. And
I mean, more specifically about your business as opposed to clients' businesses.
Yeah, like for my business, I think at the end of a project, I measure the success at least like intuitively by, have I helped them do something fresh and innovative? That's something I value a lot. That kind of is like, being a part of moving solutions into a new space. Mm-hmm. Have I learned anything new as part of the process? I think that's really important as well. And then whether or not I feel like the project has had a positive public good impact is like the other thing. So those would be like, if I was thinking about it, those would be some of the things I would care about. And then the quality of the work, absolutely, all the time. Although I didn't have a lesson on that, but I care a lot about just the quality of the work as well. And that, that it holds, you know, and I don't want to spend my time delivering mediocre, you know what I mean? There's like not enough time in life for that. But I don't track my hours accurately. You know what I mean? There's a whole bunch of things around running margins that I am a disaster at in terms of profitability too. So, I mean, maybe that's something, my next hire in an ideal world would be like an operations person for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so I just wanted to wrap up and give you a little thank you gift from Hastings County, which came from our neighbor's farm, and Samantha is here today. Thank you. So again, thank you so much. This has been an incredible talk. I have learned even more from you, even though you're my unofficial mentor. But this has just been incredible. I think you've shared a lot of really valuable lessons for everyone, and I look forward to the activities that we have after. So Christina's going to lead some activities in the reception area, and hopefully it helps move everyone's business forward a little bit. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.